No, but, a lot of people ask me about that and say, what's the secret of Mrs. Brown? And I don't know if there is any secret about Mrs. Brown. She's a bitch. I mean, she's an old cow. I also think that she's at an age where she doesn't care what she says.
Picture this for a moment. British comedy without Mrs. Brown's boys. Difficult to imagine, isn't it? Whether you adore it or can't stand it, the truth is this sitcom didn't simply arrive, it erupted. Back in 2011, it burst onto BBC, one with a bang, loud, brash, and unapologetically out of step with the polished comedies of the time. Here was a show that didn't try to be clever, subtle, or modern. It was crude, chaotic, and gloriously old school. To some, that was its downfall. To millions of others, it was its charm. Over the years, the series has managed to pull in audiences across the UK, Ireland, and even further abroad. Yet as the laughter rolled and the audience numbers soared, something else began to happen behind the scenes. Cast members, many of whom were family and friends of creator Brendan O'Carroll, started stepping away. Some left quietly, barely noticed until fans tuned in and realized they were missing. Others exited in ways that stirred controversy and speculation. The obvious question is, why? Was it family tensions, creative fallouts, or something deeper, tied to the pressures of sudden fame? To understand the exits and their impact, you first need to know the remarkable story of how Mrs. Brown's Boys came to be in the first place. Before it became one of the BBC's most watched comedies, before Christmas specials became tradition, and long before it spawned a feature film, Mrs. Brown's Boys was little more than an idea rattling around in the mind of Brendan O'Carroll. It was the early 1990s, and O'Carroll was working as a stand-up comic in Ireland. Money was tight, gigs were unpredictable, and like many performers, he was looking for that one spark that could change his fortunes. His inspiration came not from television trends or highbrow comedy, but from the very women who had raised him and surrounded him throughout his life. Irish matriarchs, the mothers, grandmothers, and aunties who carried their families on their backs with wit, grit, and more than a few choice words. O'Carroll knew these women intimately, and from them, he shaped Agnes Brown. Agnes wasn't polished or refined. She wasn't meant to be glamorous or aspirational. She was blunt, foul-mouthed, quick-tempered, but also fiercely loving and resilient. In short, she was real. O'Carroll first introduced the character not on stage, but in a radio play. That was followed by his self-published book, The Mammy, which laid out Agnes's world in print. The response was encouraging enough to convince him there was something more to be done. He began developing plays centered on the character, aiming to bring Agnes into the spotlight where she could truly come alive. But here's the twist. Brendan O'Carroll never intended to play Agnes Brown himself. He had cast an actress in the role, but on the night of a live performance, she failed to show. In the kind of move that could have gone horribly wrong but instead changed his life, Brendan grabbed a dress, slipped on a wig, and took to the stage, himself. From the very first line, audiences were hooked. There was something electric about this larger-than-life Dublin mammy being portrayed by a man who threw himself into the role with reckless abandon. Brendan wasn't just acting. He was channeling every Irish mother he had ever known, and people saw themselves in it. The cheers, the laughter, and the connection were immediate. Mrs. Brown wasn't just born that night. She became unstoppable. As the plays gained traction, Brendan began taking them across Ireland. The productions were anything but slick. Lines were flubbed, cues were missed, and more often than not, Brendan and his fellow actors broke the fourth wall to joke with the audience. Sometimes they laughed at their own mistakes. Other times they directly addressed hecklers or pointed out obvious stage slip-ups. Instead of ruining the show, these moments became its hallmark. Audiences loved the sense that what they were watching wasn't sterile or over-rehearsed. It was alive, unpredictable, and hilarious in ways that scripted television rarely allowed. The humor itself also struck a chord, particularly with working-class audiences. They recognized something, of their own family dynamics in the Browns. The bickering, the chaos, the constant teasing underlined by an undeniable love. It wasn't glamorous, but it was authentic. Agnes was the kind of mother who would insult you one moment and fight for you the next. For many, it felt like home, albeit a louder, messier version of it. Word spread, and soon the plays were touring not just in Ireland, but in the UK as well. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Mrs. Brown phenomenon was hard to ignore. Brendan O'Carroll wasn't just making a name for himself, he was carving out a brand. Still, the stage was only the beginning. The cult following was strong, but television was where legends were made. It would take nearly 2 decades before Agnes Brown would finally land on the small screen, but when she did, it would be in a way that critics couldn't stop complaining about, and audiences couldn't stop watching. When Mrs. Brown's Boys finally made the leap from stage to screen, few could have predicted the storm it would unleash. It was 2011, and the BBC took what seemed at the time like a gamble. Television comedy was shifting towards slick, tightly scripted shows with sharp writing and modern themes. Against that backdrop, Brendan O'Carroll's creation was almost defiantly old-fashioned. Shot in front of a live studio audience, it carried the same energy as the stage plays, including the mistakes. Camera flubs, forgotten lines, and bursts of improvisation were all left in. Characters broke the fourth wall, actors sometimes laughed at their own jokes, and Brendan, as Agnes, would routinely turn to the audience with a wink or a muttered aside. To some critics, this was a disaster waiting to happen, and they were quick to pounce. Reviewers tore into the show, calling it lowbrow, outdated, and cheap. They accused it of recycling humor that had been passé for decades and relying on innuendo rather than wit. By all accounts, the critical reception should have doomed Mrs. Brown's Boys before it even found its footing. But something remarkable happened. Audiences ignored the critics. In fact, they tuned in by the millions. For every harsh headline, there were families gathered in living rooms across the UK and Ireland, laughing together, week after week. And while the media elite rolled their eyes, viewers made the show one of the BBC's most watched comedies of the decade. Part of what made the show special was that it wasn't just a sitcom. It was a family affair in the truest sense. Brendan O'Carroll didn't build the cast with strangers. He filled it with the people closest to him. His wife, Jennifer Gibney, played Kathy, Agnes's long-suffering daughter. His son, Danny, stepped into the role of Dermot, the lovable but somewhat hapless son. His daughter, Fiona, portrayed Maria, Dermot's wife, adding a softer and more grounded element to the madness of the Brown household. Even his sister, Eilish, became part of the ensemble, playing Winnie McGugan, the ever-present next-door neighbor, whose catchphrases and one-liners quickly made her a fan favorite. This wasn't just clever casting, it was the secret ingredient. The chemistry that audiences felt wasn't manufactured, it was real. When Agnes shouted at her children, she was, in some ways, shouting at Brendan's own kids. When Kathy rolled her eyes at her mother, the dynamic between Jennifer Gibney and Brendan O'Carroll wasn't just acting, it was rooted in years of lived experience. That authenticity resonated with viewers who could sense that the love, and sometimes the frustration, was genuine. Of course, working with family is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it created a bond that made the show unlike anything else on television. On the other, it sometimes meant that off-screen tensions crept into the mix. Family dynamics are never simple, and as the show grew bigger, so did the pressures. The Browns weren't just a fictional family anymore. They were a global brand, and with fame came all the complications you might expect. Despite the occasional tension, the show soared. Christmas specials became must-watch events, often topping the ratings and pulling in audiences of millions. Tours sold out arenas not only in the UK and Ireland, but also as far away as Australia, where fans flocked to see Agnes Brown live on stage. DVDs and box sets flew off shelves, and spin-off books kept the brand alive between seasons. In 2014, Mrs. Brown's Boys the Movie hit cinemas. Critics, once again, savaged it. They dismissed it as lazy and crude, with some going as far as calling it one of the worst films of the year. But once again, audiences had the final word. In Ireland and the UK, the movie raked in millions at the box office, proving that no amount of critical disdain could dent the show's popularity. What Brendan O'Carroll had built went beyond a sitcom. It was, in every sense, a comedy empire. Agnes Brown's face was everywhere. On merchandise, on posters, on stage, on screen. The character had become a cultural icon, recognized across continents. Brendan himself admitted that he never expected it to become this big, but he leaned into the chaos and embraced the ride. For many families, Mrs. Brown's Boys became more than just entertainment. It became tradition. Watching the Christmas special was as much a part of the holiday season as turkey or presents under the tree. But behind the laughter and the ratings success, cracks were forming. Fame is rarely kind, and working so closely with loved ones can magnify small issues into bigger ones. As the years went by, the cast, many of whom had been there since the beginning, started making choices about their futures. Some decided to stay the course, committed to the show no matter what. Others, however, began to step away, citing everything from personal commitments to disagreements behind the scenes. And that's when fans started to notice something changing, because when you build a show around family, real family, every departure feels personal. It isn't just a character leaving the screen. It's a piece of the heart of the show, being pulled away. The departures didn't come all at once, but each one left its mark. The first major ripple came from someone very close to Brendan himself, his daughter, Fiona O'Carroll, who had been part of the Mrs. Brown's Boys world since its earliest days. The first major departure that really shook fans of Mrs. Brown's Boys came from none other than Brendan O'Carroll's daughter, Fiona. For over 2 decades, Fiona had been at the heart of the project, first on stage and then on screen. As Maria Brown, Dermot's patient and caring wife, she played a character who often brought a touch of normality into the madness of the Brown household. Maria was steady, thoughtful, and endlessly tolerant, qualities that made her a perfect foil to the whirlwind chaos that was Agnes. To many viewers, she was the grounding presence that reminded them this family, beneath all the shouting and slapstick, was real. But Maria wasn't just a role for Fiona. It was part of her life. She had grown up with Mrs. Brown's Boys. From the earliest stage shows in the 1990s, when Brendan was still testing out material, Fiona had been there, helping shape the universe of Agnes Brown long before it ever appeared on television. By the time the BBC series arrived, Maria was firmly embedded not only in the fictional family, but in the very identity of the show itself. So, when word spread in 2022 that Fiona would not be joining the live tour, the reaction was immediate and intense. Fans were shocked, confused, and more than a little concerned about what her absence might mean for the future. The reasons Fiona gave were deeply personal. After many years working so closely with her father, siblings, and extended family, she felt it was time to step back. By then, Fiona was also a mother herself, and balancing the demands of parenthood with the hectic schedule of touring and filming had become increasingly difficult. She explained that she wanted to focus on her children and on her own life outside of the show. While her explanation was honest and heartfelt, some couldn't help but speculate. After all, when your entire family is wrapped up in a project as all-consuming as Mrs. Brown's Boys, personal decisions can often be tied to private tensions. For Brendan, it was undoubtedly bittersweet. Losing his daughter from the show wasn't just a casting change. It was losing a piece of the original vision he had built with his family decades earlier. And for audiences, it was a reminder that while the Browns on screen seemed timeless, the people behind them were not. Fiona's exit marked a turning point, a moment when fans began to realize that this comedy empire was not immune to the very real struggles of balancing work, family, and personal identity, and Fiona wasn't the only one. Over the years, other cast members made their exits too, each departure sparking its own wave of speculation. One of the most talked about came from Gary Hollywood, who played Dino Doyle, the flamboyant hairdresser and one of Dermot's best friends. Dino was a character beloved for his over-the-top mannerisms and comic timing, and Gary's performance had earned him a loyal following. But in 2020, news broke that he had left the show under less than happy circumstances. Reports at the time suggested a pay dispute was at the heart of it. According to Gary, there were issues of inequality regarding pay between cast members. He felt undervalued and unappreciated despite his long-standing contribution to the show. The dispute escalated, and eventually Gary decided to walk away. Brendan O'Carroll, for his part, denied any wrongdoing, insisting that there had been no unfair treatment. But by then, the damage was done. Dino Doyle was gone, and fans were left to wonder whether financial disagreements had fractured the tight-knit family the show prided itself on. Another familiar face to step back was Damian McKiernan, who had taken on the role of Rory Brown, Agnes's openly gay son. The character of Rory had been played by Rory Cowan for years, but when Cowan left in 2017 citing unhappiness with his role and a desire for a new chapter, McKiernan stepped in to continue the part. For many fans, Rory was a crucial element of the show, not only for the humor he brought, but also for the representation he offered. However, in 2020, both McKiernan and Gary Hollywood departed at the same time, again reportedly tied to tensions behind the scenes. Brendan later addressed the exits, but the sense of unease among fans remained. The ripple effect of these departures couldn't be ignored. For a show that had built its reputation on being a family, both literally and figuratively, the loss of long-term cast members felt different than it would on another sitcom. When someone left Mrs. Brown's Boys, it wasn't just a character missing from the script. It was like a seat at the family dinner table had been left empty. The laughter continued, but fans couldn't help noticing the gaps. Behind the scenes, Brendan tried to reassure viewers that the heart of the show was intact. He reminded people that the core, Agnes, Kathy, Dermot, and Winnie, were still there, and the chemistry remained strong. And to an extent, he was right. Ratings stayed solid, and the Christmas specials continued to draw huge audiences. But no matter how strong the core remained, each departure chipped away at the illusion of an unbreakable family unit. For the actors who left, their reasons varied, some personal, some professional, some a combination of both. Fiona wanted to devote time to her own family. Rory Cowan admitted he was simply unhappy and needed a change. Gary Hollywood believed he deserved fairer treatment and pay. Each story was different, but the end result was the same. The world of Mrs. Brown's Boys began to shift, reminding fans that even the strongest family comedies are not immune to real-world challenges. What's remarkable, however, is how the show endured. Despite departures, disputes, and constant critical backlash, the Brown family kept going. Year after year, Brendan O'Carroll slipped back into his dress and wig, delivering punchlines with the same fiery energy that first won audiences over decades earlier. But there was no denying that the exits left their mark, changing the shape and feel of the show in ways both subtle and profound. As the dust settles on years of laughter, drama, departures, and speculation, one thing becomes clear. Mrs. Brown's Boys is not just a television show. It is a cultural phenomenon that challenged the boundaries of what mainstream comedy could look like in the 21st century. At a time when humor was being polished, packaged, and often sanitized for mass audiences, Brendan O'Carroll and his band of misfits, family, friends, and fellow actors, delivered something unapologetically raw. The jokes might have been brash, the costumes sometimes a little ridiculous, and the storyline simple, but what the show gave to its audience was a kind of comfort, a familiarity, and above all, a reason to laugh out loud together. And while critics may still roll their eyes, the truth is undeniable. Millions tuned in year after year, proving that comedy isn't always about sophistication. It's about connection. But for fans who had watched the cast shrink over the years, the question remained: could Mrs. Brown's Boys survive without its original lineup? Fiona O'Carroll's departure was just one of several changes that shifted the dynamic of the show, and while the replacements carried the torch, audiences could feel the difference. It's the nature of a series that relies so heavily on its ensemble. Every actor brings a piece of themselves to the stage, and when one piece is missing, the puzzle feels just a little incomplete. Yet Brendan O'Carroll, ever the driving force, pressed on. He wasn't about to let go of the character that had defined his career and become a beloved figure across the UK and Ireland. Agnes Brown was more than just a role. It was an identity, a legacy, and perhaps even a lifeline. That legacy stretches beyond the TV screen. For Brendan, Mrs. Brown's Boys was never just about making people laugh. It was about creating a family both on and off the screen. When viewers sat down for a Christmas special, they weren't just watching actors recite lines. They were watching a family, flaws and all, share something authentic. The mistakes left in, the laughter spilling over from the cast, the knowing. Glances between Brendan and his co-stars, those weren't staged, they were real moments of connection. And that reality, as much as the scripted jokes, kept audiences invested. Even when tensions brewed behind the scenes, and even when certain actors chose to walk away, the spirit of that family lingered, reminding viewers why they fell in love with the show in the first place. In the years since, debates over Mrs. Brown's Boys have continued. Some critics still dismiss it as lowbrow slapstick, while others insist it deserves recognition as one of the boldest comedies to break through in recent decades. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle. It was never meant to be refined art. It was meant to be fun, a throwback to an older style of comedy that put audience reaction above critical praise. And in that sense, Brendan O'Carroll achieved exactly what he set out to do. Whether you love it or hate it, the show has earned its place in comedy history by refusing to apologize for what it is. As for the cast who left, their stories remain, just as much a part of the show's history as the episodes themselves. Fiona O'Carroll, Gary Hollywood, and others who quietly stepped away left fans with questions, but also with gratitude for the years they gave to the series. They built characters that felt real, lived in our living rooms, and gave us countless laughs. Their absence is felt, but their impact is undeniable. And maybe, in some ways, their departures serve as a reminder of the show's deeper message, that family, whether blood, chosen, or fictional, is always changing, but the love and laughter remain. So when we look back on Mrs. Brown's Boys, what do we see? A show that critics derided but fans adored. A cast that began as a tight-knit family, weathered storms, and endured losses. A matriarch in Brendan O'Carroll's Agnes Brown, who became as iconic as any character in modern British comedy. And, above all, a legacy of laughter that, even with its bumps and bruises, continues to resonate. Because at the end of the day, comedy doesn't have to be perfect to matter. It just has to make you laugh when you need it most. And perhaps that's the ultimate takeaway. Behind the wigs, the dresses, the crude jokes, and the chaos, Mrs. Brown's Boys reminded us that sometimes the simplest things are the most powerful. A joke shared with family. A laugh that breaks through sadness. A tradition of gathering together to watch a story unfold, even if it's messy, unpredictable, and imperfect. That's the gift Brendan O'Carroll gave the world. And that's why, no matter who left or what critics said, Mrs. Brown's Boys will always hold a place in television history. and in the hearts of those who saw in it not just comedy, but comfort.